Assalamu alaikum, everyone. You are listening to episode 36 of the Muhammad Ghailan podcast with yours truly as the host. Before we get on to today's topic, just a quick announcement for Andalus Book Club members. The first part of a 5 part video series on Soul Machine, The Invention of the Modern Mind by George Macari. This is the book that we're covering this month. The first part is now live and available for you to go and watch. It's an over-hour long video where I go through and just give a basic introduction and an overview on the subject matter of consciousness. Soul Machine is a book where George Macari goes through and gives a historical outline of how we got to where we are today with regards to modernity's view on the soul, the mind, consciousness, the heart problem. He goes and outlines all of the different figures that got involved into this discussion, Enlightenment Europe, post-Enlightenment, and all the arguments that took place and the positions that they took. And it's quite a brilliant book. It's a big book. It's over 600 pages with the endnotes. And I figured because of the subject matter that it deals with, it's not really dinner table conversation. Not a lot of people talk about consciousness or deal with it. And even if you're interested in it, you may not be well versed in the subject matter. So this hour-long introduction video is a good premiere for those who don't know anything about the subject. It gives you an outline of it. It gives you the philosophical theories that are involved in the subject matter, the debates that are there. And I also offer a bit of a commentary. I don't go too much in depth in it because I want to keep it just introductory level for those who are not well versed in the subject. But I do give a bit of a commentary with regards to the Islamic position, theologically speaking, and the problems that we might have with some of them. Now, this 5 part video series, the first part is the intro. The next 4 parts are just going to go over the book itself, because the book is divided into 4 parts. And that should hopefully prepare you for the live webinar towards the end of the month for the members when we actually have a discussion about it. There's nothing more frustrating than trying to get engaged in a discussion where you don't even know the language that is being utilized. So I'm hoping these videos will help you guys out and give you a better appreciation or a greater appreciation of the subject matter that we're dealing with. So yeah, you can go and check that out. If you're not a member of Andalus Book Club, it's a good segue. If you want to support this work, this is really the best way that you can support this work, this podcast, is to become a member of Andalus Book Club. By that, you would also be gaining access to member exclusive videos and webinars and such. I do this live webinar every month, so you'll have access to that as well. So that's one way for you to support this work. Another way, you can go to patreon.com and, pledge $2, $3, whatever it is that you can do to help this work and to help me basically, upgrade equipment, pay for bills and such. And finally, I would really appreciate it for those of you who haven't done so, if you can go over to iTunes and rate this show. The way these shows make it up the charts is by basically having people go and rate them and let everybody know about them. And so the more reviews and the more high ratings there are for it, the higher it climbs up on the charts and the more people that are looking for the subject matter will find it. So there's that, and there's also social media. I would love it if you guys could share these episodes and tag me on Twitter and Facebook if you do. That way I can reshare it on my end as well. So that's it for housekeeping announcement stuff. What I wanted to talk about this week is the subject of truth. How do you know what is true? I mean, this thing I've been talking about over several lectures and podcasts before, talking about certainty, having certainty in your beliefs. How do you know what you know is true or not? It's an important theological topic. When you say that you believe there is only one God and you believe that the Prophet Muhammad is the final messenger, I mean, how do you know that these things are true? What does it mean even when you make that statement? Now, this is not going to be a theology episode. I'm not going to go through arguments for the existence of God or anything like that. What I want to talk about is specifically what makes something true. If you hear a proposition, if somebody says something to you, or if you make a statement, what makes that statement true as such? Now, if you go and review the philosophical literature on this, you'll find a bunch of theories and you'll find a lot of, let's say, ivory tower discussions. There are really two theories, though, that I think are more practical and relevant for our day to day lives. And if you understand these two theories and understand your positioning, you will start to see clearly when you start to have these tensions and dilemmas when you're presented with information. I know a lot of my listeners are in college age, university age, or even older, and they're involved in the mathematics, engineering, medicine, sciences. And so a lot of the questions that come up usually have to do with the relationship between science and religion. And there is this general assumption that when you're talking about science, you're talking about claims about the world that are true. There's also people that come up, and I do get questions about certain rulings in the tradition, rulings in Islam, in the Sharia, that may not mesh well with your, I don't know if you want to call it sensibilities. It's just there's something about them that doesn't feel right or doesn't sit right with you. Now, if you get an appreciation to these two theories with regards to truth and understand how they fit in, you'll start to see why you have these dilemmas. Now, to start off with the first theory, one way to judge something as true is if it corresponds with the way that things actually are. That is to say that what I say matches with the facts in the observable realm. This is known as the correspondence theory of truth. And this, if you go through the history of it, it goes back to people like Bertrand Russell. But according to this correspondence theory, a belief is judged to be true if there exists an entity, a fact, to which it corresponds. If there is no such entity, that belief is false. So if I make a statement, this statement has to match up with some fact in the external world. And if there is no fact as such, if this fact doesn't exist, then what I'm saying is false. Now, as any good, as good philosophers, we're going to look at that and we're going to ask the question, well, what makes a fact a fact? I mean, what do you mean by fact? And this is a really important thing to start doing if you're not doing it already. Whenever you engage in a discussion about any subject matter, you have to ask the question, well, what do you mean when you say such and such? In the context of belief in God, before you start having an argument or presenting an argument about the existence of God, the first thing you have to do is define, what do you mean by God? Same thing with right now when we're talking about Soul Machine and Consciousness, the book that we're covering this month in Andalus Book Club. One of the first things we have to identify is state the problem. What is consciousness? Define it. And once you start going down that rabbit hole, you will start to find that a lot of the discussions people are having or arguments and debates would be kind of irrelevant, because you'll find that the way they define terms is different. And if your definition of a word is different than mine, and we both think that we're talking about the same thing, we'll be talking over each other. So in this particular case, what does it mean to say that there is a fact out there? What is a fact? The way this definition of correspondence theory makes it sound like is that if this fact doesn't exist, then what I'm saying is not true. So it's really talking about a type of fact. Not all types of facts are equivalent. There is a type of fact called a positive fact. Positive fact is it's something that's out there that exists that I can go and measure or hold on to or see. It's observable. That's a positive fact. But there is such a thing as a negative fact. A negative fact is one where, let's say that I said I did not have breakfast today. So that's a negative fact. There's nothing you can do to go and hold on to it. It's not an entity. It's not a thing. And you can't really prove a negative necessarily. But it's still a fact. That's a negative fact. So if I said that and this fact does not exist, does that mean it's not corresponding with something? Well, of course it is. It's corresponding with my lack of breakfast having. So that's a true statement, but it doesn't really fit well with the definition of correspondence theory. There's another type of fact called counterfactual fact. And in counterfactual facts, what you do is Let's say that someone is passing by a power line that's broken down and it's on the road, and they tell you that, hey, power line, stay at least 10 feet away from it. Do not come near it. Now, this is a counterfactual fact, because if you go near this power line and get electrocuted and die, you would have rejected the true statement of do not come near here because this will happen. It's counterfactual in the sense that you have to engage in the action to bring about forth into existence the fact that is being countered. But you believe it to be true, and that's what keeps you alive. You believe this fact, which does not exist right now, as true, because if you did it and if it comes to existence, you would die. So you believe that it's true and you avoid the power line. These are counterfactual facts. So these are just like, ivory tower type of discussions that philosophers engage in, and they say like, oh, what do you know about this, and what does it mean to say a fact and such. It's relevant for us in the real world in the sense that we have to define terms. We have to understand what we're talking about. If you're going to make a statement or going to give a definition or going to talk about truth, you have to know what you're talking about. Another way to judge something as true is to examine whether it coheres with other propositions. So this is a different way of looking at things. This is called a coherence theory of truth. So we had the correspondence theory, where I make a statement and I want that statement to match up with something out there in the material existence. Coherence theory, on the other hand, the difference between correspondence and coherence theories is really a major one. And this is, if you understand the difference between them, you will get to the bottom of so many different issues that you have, or you might have, with a lot of things that are being said, especially in the realm of religion versus science, religion versus politics, religion versus culture, all of these things. The difference is that in correspondence, you are looking for a relationship between a thought in your mind and something out there that is not a thought. That's correspondence, which is independent of you. So you're looking for a fact that has nothing to do with you, and you have this thought that is generated from within, and then you try to match them up. On the other hand, with coherence, it's not the external world that matters. It's the system of thought that you have. You have a system of thought. You have a system of propositions. That system of propositions is true. And then the thought that's generated, the new thought, the new statement that you're making, you look for that thought to be coherent with the system of thoughts that you have. Now, most people think that when they judge something as true, they're relying on correspondence. Because that's the obvious, it's the intuitive thing to think of. I make a statement, it's matching up with something in the external reality, that's what makes it true. That's valid for some times, but other times, or most of the time, what's really going on is that we are relying on coherence of statements to systems of thought. I'll give you a couple of examples just to make this a little bit closer. It's really difficult for us to talk today about East and West, and the West and the East, and the Muslim world versus the non-Muslim world. It's really difficult to talk about this now because if you just the example I bring up is Pharrell's "Happy," that song that came out a few years ago. When that song came out, look at how quickly the song and the videos spread across the planet. People were making the happy dancing videos everywhere. And if you really examine the videos, you'll notice that people were really doing the same thing. And you will notice that fashion choices are very similar across the planet. What we're living in is a monoculture. This artificial divide, or this geographical divide, let's say, between East and West, and the ideological divide that you can make between Muslim versus non-Muslim is very difficult to make now because mass communication, the internet, and just transportation, how quickly you can go from one side of the planet to the other and bring about cultural change if you are an influencer, quote-unquote influencer, is very quick. So we live in a monoculture. Part of popular culture And especially if you are someone who is constantly consuming social media, you are constantly Hollywood, and the general cultural discourse. And if you're in academia or if you're a highly educated person, the general value system that you have adopted, and oftentimes we adopt these value systems unknowingly. We implicitly take them on because we passively absorb them through our education system. The thing is, when you go to university, you're not just being taught explicit information and just a set of propositions and models, and then you come and reproduce them. There is an ideology that is embedded within that. There is a philosophy that is embedded within that, a value system that you adopt and then you go about in the world. So depending on your friends, depending on your education, depending on also your entertainment consumption, just being alive today, just being out there, just basically going out, you will find yourself being exposed to a lot of things. And as you go about your day and having your discussions, you will start to adopt some things. You will start to adopt beliefs and value systems that you maybe not aware of. And most people don't really sit back and contemplate on these things. So you have a coherent system of thought. You have a coherent value system. It's coherent within itself. That's not to say that it's true or false. We're just talking about the set of propositions, the set of thoughts within the system. It's coherent within each other, all of them together. So you have, let's say, a liberal leftist value system that's dominating academia, the entertainment world. And so you adopt all of these things and you take them on and then you go about your day. Next thing you know, you hear of an Islamic ruling, or you go through the biography of the Prophet ﷺ, or you hear the Imam at the mosque make a statement, and you find that this statement is not really meshing well with you. It's not sitting well. This is where you have to differentiate between the fitrah, this natural innate dispensation towards that which is good and pure and true and whatnot, and just you having adopted a value system, not knowing it, and that value system has now basically set up your emotional reaction to be reactive in a way where if you get proposed or you get told something, if it doesn't cohere with it, you think it's not true. It creates a tension within the person when you get presented with things that don't really mesh with your value system. So the question that you ask yourself is, why is this bothering me? If you look at a lot of the modern day so-called quote-unquote Muslim reformers, and by the way, these guys are not really unique. The only unique thing about the modern age is the ability to engage in mass communication, which results in change at a much faster pace and results in the notoriety of a people and giving them platforms at a much larger scale than they had back in the day. But if you go through the history of Islam, and especially in the 19th and the colonial times, especially 18th, 19th century, 20th, early 20th century, there are many figures that came across that were also so-called quote-unquote Muslim reformers that many of us have never heard of. And the only reason these people's names are recorded in history is because there are some academics who like to study this stuff. But they also gave their own insane propositions for quote-unquote Islamic reform that just were by and large rejected. And the reason these things get rejected is because for most Muslim reformers that come around today, if you want to create a change in the Muslim society, in Muslim polity, in Muslim thinking, what do you have to do? You ask any observant Muslim, they will tell you, if you're going to make a statement, if you're going to convince me of something, to change my behavior in a way, you first have to show me your proof, show me your evidence. Where is your backing from the Quran and the Sunnah? I want to know. I'll give you an example. When I wrote this article a couple of years back on veganism, you can find it on the Medina Institute. It was a provocatively titled article, The Halal Bubble and the Sunnah Imperative to Go Vegan. I had a lot of lashback on that, and a lot of the reactions to it, as far as I can tell, every single reaction that I've seen from it indicates that the person didn't read the article, which makes sense. It's nearly 10,000 words. But if you want to change behavior, the way that I constructed the article was in line with a lot of what I believe to be a properly scholarly discourse in Islamic scholarship, which is you have to provide your evidence from the Quran, provide it from authentic hadith, provide it from companions, authentic narrations, and show me that it's coherent with Islamic values, with the Islamic tradition. If it's a coherent thing, and veganism, by the way, just as a side note, on a tangent, if you're going to be vegan as a Muslim, the way that you go about it and the value system and the philosophy, the underlying assumptions, the justifications, a lot of it is actually not going to sit well with popular veganism. It's not the same. And in fact, as a Muslim vegan, you would have to every once in a while go out and consume some meat because you don't want to get in a position where you start to have a moral judgment on something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made halal for you. So, but that's maybe on another subject line. So if you're going to be engaged in Muslim reformation, and I don't like the term reform because it indicates that you don't like the form as it is and you want to change the whole thing. And that's really what modern day Muslim reformers are trying to do. They're trying to change the religion itself. They're trying to make palatable things that are known by religion by necessity. They're known from religion by necessity. It's what's called in Arabic ma'lum min ad-din bil-darura. They're trying to change these things and make them that you're trying to make the unacceptable acceptable. The reason these people get rejected is because every Muslim, every sane Muslim who knows the tradition, what they do is they look at the statement and then they judge it based on its coherence or incoherence with the Islamic tradition. Majority of Muslim reformers out there today, 99% of their statements are incoherent with the Islamic tradition, and that's why they get rejected. Like I said, when you look at the system of thought, the system itself, we're not talking about the system being true. We're talking about the statement you're making. Is it true within that system? To judge the system itself as true, that's another meta level. That's another thing. That's when we talk about theology and arguments for the existence of God and arguments for the truth of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Once you establish that and you accept Islam as a true religion, now you judge statements, behaviors, things like that in accordance with the coherence of this. Now, there is a small issue here. If you accept that Islam as a system of rulings, a system of ethics, a system of morals and values and things like that, you accept that as true. The question you have to ask is the specifics of this tradition. Because we know that the Quran, while we believe it to be unchanged, while we believe it to be complete, we believe the religion itself to be complete, we believe that the Prophet ﷺ's message was delivered in totality, we believe that there is no more messengers after him, no more revelation. We believe on all of these things. But the question you ask is, where does the relationship between the human mind and the text itself come in? Where are the negotiables? And where are the non-negotiables? Where are we talking about details that were expounded by scholars, let's say, and as great as the scholars are and as much reverence that we have for them, we still have to recognize that we're dealing with human beings. And by virtue of the fact that they are human beings, it means that number one, they are fallible, because infallibility ended with the passing of the Prophet ﷺ. He was the last infallible person, according to Muslim belief. And secondly, as human beings living in their time, they were inevitably impacted and affected by their modern political climate, by their current political climate, by their current scientific knowledge, by their current economies, by their current culture. I mean, if you look at the way that Muslim scholars in Andalusia would come up with rulings and engage with the tradition and the things that they would say in comparison to ones that were, let's say, from the Hijaz area or even from Iraq, you'll have a vast ones in Africa. I mean, you'll see differences in the way that the tradition is approached. They're all dealing with the same text. They're all coming by and large in many cases with similar rulings, but there are certain things where they differ with each other. Moreover, depending on the scholar's background, so you have a scholar that who maybe worked, like look at Ibn Rushd, for example. This person was a judge as well as a jurist, a faqih. He was also a physician, so he had knowledge of the human body. He had the scientific knowledge. Look at someone like Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi. He was a mufassir. He was someone who wrote exegesis, one of the largest, if not the largest exegesis of the Quran. Largest commentary on the Quran is Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi's text. And he was also a scientist. He was a physicist in his own right. So he had this background. These scholars had different backgrounds. You have scholars that have nothing to do with science, and all they focused on was just specifically the linguistic aspects of the religion, and that's all they really focused on: their language, the rulings, derivations, things like that. And they just worked on law. They were basically lawyers, and that's it. So based on that, having different backgrounds and coming to the tradition, what you find is that the tradition speaks to everybody according to their intellects, and it unveils itself in different ways to different people based on their levels of intelligence as well as their background. So the problem that we have when we talk about a coherent system of thought is, what are the elements that we have within this coherent system of thought that are unequivocal, unchanging, we can never discuss anything about them? And what are the elements that this was a scholarly effort? As much as we respect them, this may have been valid for their time, but we have to re-examine the original text and utilize advancements that we have so that we can derive, and changes. I mean, the politics has changed. The political climate has changed. The environment has changed. The general culture has changed. There's a lot of changes. That's not to say that you want to make Islam fit in within the current paradigm and just have it serve it. That is not what we're saying here. But what we're saying is that you have to examine the changes and the contextual realities that you have. I really like the statement that Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya made one time when he was asked about extremists. And he said, هؤلاء قوم جهلوا الدليل وتجاهلوا التأويل فأخطأوا التنزيل. These are people who are ignorant of the evidence itself, the direct text. They don't even know the exact what's going on in the text. They don't know how to understand it. They don't know how to read it. They don't know the text. They don't know the proof. وتجاهلوا التأويل. And they ignored the interpretation. They ignored the tradition, the interpretive tradition. They ignored the need that sometimes you might have to re-examine that interpretation in light of your contextual realities. فأخطأوا التنزيل. And so they mistakenly applied rulings. They thought they were doing something that was valid, but it was invalid because the context in which they were applying it is invalid. It doesn't work. It's not the same context. And so that's just about the coherent system. So when you're judging something as coherent, the question you have to ask yourself is, which system am I trying to make this statement coherent within so that I can accept it as true? Am I trying to make it coherent within, let's say, a liberal value system that is by and large secularist, anti-religion, anti-theist, humanist type of materialist ideology? Is that what I'm trying to make things coherent with? Because that's what I've adopted. Or are you trying to make it coherent within an Islamic tradition so that you're looking through an Islamic lens to everything? There's a verse that I constantly keep reminding people. وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا لِتَكُونُوا شُهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ وَيَكُونَ الرَّسُولُ عَلَيْكُمْ شَهِيدًا. This is in Surah Al-Baqarah, the second chapter of the Quran, and it's actually in the middle, verse 143 of a 286 verse chapter. It says, like so we have made you a middle nation so that you may bear witness upon others, upon the people. Testify to the truth, and the messenger will testify over you as well. So the Muslim position is a very difficult position to be in, because on the one hand you want to recognize contextual changes and realities that have imposed themselves. On the other hand, you also want to recognize that you are here as a representative, you are here as a khalifa, you are here as someone who is trying to stay true to your commitment to Islam, to God, to the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And when you do see things that are definitely out of line, you want to say that this is out of line, and you want to speak against that. So that's just a coherence bit. The other one is where we think that we're making a correspondence statement is with regards to science. A lot of people think that when you make a scientific statement, you are making a statement that is corresponding with a fact. And so they believe they're making this correspondence is what gives them claim to truth. However, what you're still doing is really a coherence. And here's how it works. We know that just by virtue of you going out to measure anything, to measure a behavior, to measure a behavior or a phenomenon, the very specific action of you measuring changes the behavior of the thing that you're trying to measure. Look at the electron double slit experiment if you want to go into detail about that. But just the fact that you're starting to measure something or observe something, the behavior of that thing changes. We know that even from humans. As soon as we start observing people, they start to change their behavior. There is a study that just came out questioning a very long period of time that they examined. I think it was chimps. I can't remember where exactly, but they were observing them for something like 20 years. And they just found out that their behavior was altered by virtue of the fact that there were scientists out there, biologists, that were looking at them. And so the chimps were not behaving in the way that they would normally behave had they not been under scrutiny. So when it comes to science, it may sound nice and simple and it's straightforward and it's black and white, this is a fact, but really what's going on, it's not a fact all the time. Some of these things are, and I covered this in the series at Philosophy of Science in the Andalus Book Club video series there, but just briefly, you have theory-laden data, you have a history of science that tells you that there are things that were proposed to even exist physically, like the phlogiston, that were found out later to not even have an existence. Things that experimentally were confirmed even, that later on were found out to be just a figment of somebody's imagination, a byproduct of just the way that the experiment is done. So you think you're making a statement that's coherent, that's corresponding with facts, but what you're really making is a statement that's coherent with a system of propositions within the scientific model that you are examining. So what you have is, when you have people come in and make a statement that says, I'm observing something, and then you're telling me in the tradition, in the Islamic tradition, it's something else, what ends up happening is that when you have Muslims reject a scientific claim, and let's call the elephant in the room, it's theory of evolution. When Muslims reject the claim about Adam alayhi salam, what they're doing is they're rejecting a coherence claim. They're saying that the coherence of the creation of Adam, the story that we have, if you say that Adam alayhi salam and Eve alayhi salam were not created in that way, you're saying that they were evolved, regardless of how you try to make it mesh, to give it a theological angle, to talk about creative evolution. For a lot of Muslims, the way that they understand the creation story, according to the Quran and the Hadith, they will tell you that statement is going to be incoherent with what we have, and therefore we reject it. And that's why we reject it as false. And we believe what we have is the truth. Now, there is how do you know? Why would you reject that? And even though people can show you studies, they can show you genetics, they can show you a lot of different things to give evidence to bolster the claim that the existence of human beings on this planet came about through a gradual evolutionary process. There's a couple of things. Number one, with regards to the religious side, the coherence story, there is a text written on this. The one that comes to mind is Muhammad Hussein al-Dhahabi for the Arabic speakers, and it's talking about the Isra'iliyat في القرآن والحديث, في التفسير والحديث. He talks about this Azhari scholar wrote a text, and he's not the only one. There are others that have written on the subject, which is the influence of Israelite narrations, rabbis that have converted to Islam and brought about details to stories that we have in the Quran and the Hadith that don't have the details that we think they have. So a lot of the companions, when they were getting stories, for example, you look at Surah Al-Kahf, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, سيقولون ثلاثة رابعهم كلبهم ويقولون خمسة سادسهم كلبهم ويقولون سبعة وثامنهم كلبهم قل ربي أعلم بعدتهم. They'll tell you they're three, the people of the cave. There were three and the fourth was the dog. They will tell you there were five and the sixth was the dog. They will tell you there were seven and the eighth was the dog. Just say my Lord is more knowledgeable over. My Lord knows how many they were. The thing about the story itself, while we believe the story is true and there were people of the cave and everything about the story is true, the specific details about how many they were and how long their hair was and how long their nails got and all of that stuff, none of that matters. That is irrelevant to the greater lesson to be derived from that story. That's not to say that it's a myth and it's fake and none of this happened and it's just a story to pass time by. This is a real story, but there are details that you can get into which you have no right getting into. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you in the Quran, this is none of your business anyways. It doesn't matter. The same thing with the creation of Adam alayhi salam. The specific details that people think, that a lot of Muslims think, the step-by-step process, almost like baking cookies or something. Like you have the step-by-step ingredients and all of the details that you think are there, they're not actually in the Quran as the way that you think they are. And the Quranic narration of it is not as unequivocal as you think that it is. And much of the interpretation, there are a lot of Israelite narrations that have crept into it to give details that are not necessarily valid. The Prophet ﷺ did say, however, حدثوا عن بني إسرائيل ولا حرج لا تصدقوهم ولا تكذبوهم. You are allowed, you're permitted to take narrations from Israelite narrations, but he sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, don't believe them and don't reject them. You can only reject them if you know that what they're telling you is directly contradicting something in the Quran, something that is known from religion by necessity. But if it's not, and it's just neutral information, you can take it, but you don't have to accept it, and it's not part of your theology. It's not part of your belief system. So that's with regards to the coherence from the religious side. Let's talk about the coherence from the scientific side, because there are a lot of people that want to prop up this, evolution is a fact. It's not a fact. Evolution is, as a theory, it is a model, and this model takes into account available information that we have gathered. Now, you have to recognize that information is limited. We don't have the full story. And every day, new findings come about from archaeology, from genetics, from proteomics. There's so much information that comes about that is telling you, that challenges some of these propositions from the scientific community. You have to recognize that you're dealing with a system of propositions, and new propositions that come up, they try to fit it in and see if it's coherent within it. You're not dealing with correspondence here with a fact that's out there. You're dealing with a coherence of a system of thoughts, system of propositions in the scientific method. The power of it is that it allows you to make predictions. There's falsifiability in there. And if you're engaged in the scientific process, there is a difference between someone who just reads about science or reads philosophy of science and someone who actually engages in the scientific process. For those who engage in the scientific process, there is really a strong, compelling aspect to it, that when you do the experiment and you had a prediction in mind, and that prediction is either falsified or confirmed, and then you do it in multiple ways, and you test your thoughts with empirical means, and they come up in a way that it's really compelling. So it really, you cannot blame somebody who is, say, they're an evolutionary biology or they're a scientist in general, and they look at the stuff and they can't. It creates such a cognitive dissonance. It creates such a tension that because there is a bit of correspondence there. I'm looking at something that's out there, and you cannot tell me that the world is an illusion. So where is the relationship, though? Where is the difference between correspondence and coherence? At what level am I just talking correspondence, and at what level am I starting to talk about coherence with the statements that I'm coming up with? You have to recognize something. Those pictures that a lot of us see in Scientific American and Nature, especially with evolutionary pictures. You know, they show you the apes and stuff in the field and they're walking about with their little ape babies and stuff. These are artists' renditions. Nobody went back 500,000 years and looked at things, you know, with a drone to look at and see, like, film what's going on and then come back and draw it for you. Nobody's done that. What it is relying on, these are artists who have a science background. They take skulls, they take physical objects, and based on that, there is actually a whole tradition, there's a whole science of taking a skull and you can generate how somebody might have looked like based on dimensions in the skull and the way that it's the way that it's put together. And so that's what it's based on. Now, there is a lot of, as you can imagine, there's a lot of imagination that goes into it. Yeah, there is a basis of fact in there. There's a foundation, there's the skull, but then you have to create, to have your imagination exercised. The question you have to ask yourself now is, at what point do you stop accepting the imaginations of artists as facts? That's a question that a lot of people don't really reflect on. Many of us look at these pictures and we take them as true. There's a study that showed if you show people the same paper and divide the people into two groups, divide a group of test subjects into two groups. One group show them the paper and just have them read it, and the other group show them the paper with figures. You actually get a significant, I think it was like something like 50%, but a huge significant increase in acceptability of the findings if there are figures. So the power of something like evolutionary theory on the mind is not necessarily because people have looked at the data. There is a very strong, compelling, attractive feature to having all of these images, you being bombarded by these images, especially from a very young age. People that study science from a young age and they get taught the theory of evolution, and then you go through college and you have everything presented to you with these images, you start to think that this has to be the truth and it's a fact, rather than this is a model. I've spoken about this before with regards to the difference between realism and anti-realism, and this is actually also discussed in the greater scheme of things within the philosophy of truth, in the theories of truth. Realism and anti-realism. When it comes to science, there are two ways of going about it. One way is to think that whatever is out there is real as it is, and any information you get from it, it's reflecting reality. And the other way is anti-realism. And anti-realism says, yeah, you're getting information, but that does not necessarily reflect reality. What it reflects is your intellectual constructs. And that, from my perspective, actually is the more humble position that allows for further advancements at a higher rate. Because you're looking at the world and you're not worshiping your own intellect at it. You're looking at the world and trusting that this exists. There are patterns out there that I'm investigating with the scientific method. And what I gain is what's called ephemeral truths. They're true for now, but they could change. I always hold one card close to my chest that I'm hedging my bets. I accept it for now, but things could change. And I'm going to keep an open mind for things to change. The power of the intellect is really phenomenal because we start to forget ourselves and we start to believe our own intellectual constructs to be reality. When that happens, by the way, you have a very lengthy period of time. I mean, people blame Aristotle for setting back science for like 900 years. Well, that's because you've believed in an intellectual construct to be reflectant of reality, rather than, you know what, this is something that we have for now. If we get extra information that could challenge this, so be it. And we're just going to go along with it. So this is really where a lot of the conflicts with regards to truth come in. It lies within coherence. It's not about correspondence. People think it's about correspondence, but it's really about coherence. I have a system of thought, and I'm looking at another system of thought. And all you have to do is deconstruct your systems of thought to see whether the new proposition can really fit. Sometimes it can, sometimes it can't. From a Muslim perspective, if your proposition is you are any unable to make your proposition fit in within an Islamic, coherent Islamic theology and a coherent Islamic ruling and Quranic narrative and all that, if you cannot do that whatsoever, then that statement will never be accepted because it doesn't fit in. And if I believe that the system that I have, which I arrived at this belief through pure reason, by the way, that the Prophet ﷺ is true, the Quran is true, that Allah exists. I got to all of this through pure reason. My experience, my perceptions, which, by the way, can be fooled a lot of times. A lot of people, if you just go browse briefly through the cognitive science literature, you will start to question your perceptions about everything. You can't always trust your perceptions. So the empirical realm that people just have today in the modern world exalts so much. Your perception of it is so limited, and your perception could be diluted so often that it makes it very difficult for you to make a case and say that my perception is true. Because that's really what you're saying with regards to science. If you reject a statement, if you accept a statement and reject what you accepted through pure reason with regards to religion, what you're saying is I'm exalting my perceptions and making my perceptions reign supreme. These are the true. This is the truth. Rather than Islam is the truth, my perceptions could be mistaken. There's a difference between the two. At any rate, I just wanted to keep this as brief as possible because there are a lot of different theories that with regards to truth and how it's discussed. And I've heard very lengthy podcasts and people discuss this, and it's just they're going around in circles. So I tried to make this as succinct and as clear as possible for you guys. Hopefully it wasn't too jumbled, and hopefully you can appreciate where this kind of fits in. I would love your comments and your feedback on this. If you want to hear more about it or if you have questions about it, please go ahead and send away. You can send me a message through Facebook, or you can just check out the contact form at andalusonline.org. I think with that, I'll leave you for this week and I'll bid you farewell. Once again, for Andalus Book Club members, the first part of Soul Machine is live and available for you to view it. If you're not a member, you can just join Andalus Book Club and support this work that way. And just a reminder with the iTunes ratings, I'd really appreciate you guys going out there and just giving me a 5-star rating if you think this work deserves it, and writing a short comment. سبحانك اللهم بحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.